So can you all hear me if I don't use a mic? I'd love not to use a mic. Okay. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Ken Egan, Executive Director of Humanities Montana, and we are partnering with the Missoula Cultural Council to put on a forum, Art, the Arts, and Civic Engagement. We're doing this as part of Arts and Humanities Month, which is an entire month, officially declared, by the way, by our Lieutenant Governor, declared for Montana. And the idea is to celebrate, pay attention to, nurture the arts and humanities in the state of Montana. People frequently ask me, what is the difference between the arts and the humanities? Frankly, I think it's a difference without distinction. It's often a kind of meaningless issue, but I'll give you a very brief expose. So one way of viewing it is the arts, so-called, are the performing arts. So that would include painting, dancing, singing, right? The humanities typically are the reflecting arts. That's where we step back and we try to think through what's happening to us, right? And so that would include the disciplines of history, philosophy, and art criticism, which is what's going to happen tonight. Essentially, you're going to be participating in what we might call an art criticism or a humanities event as we try to think about the role of the arts in our culture. I have to give double thanks to both Debbie Florence and Tom Benson at the Missoula Cultural Council. They're the ones who really proposed this. We, in effect, are the partners, right? And they're the ones who really stepped forth and really come up with this idea. So a brief comment about procedure. So we're going to go in this sequence. Raphael Chacon will lead off. Raphael is an art history prof here at the University of Montana. He'll be followed by Katie Knight, who is an artist and teacher and art advocate, really, in Helena, followed by Amy Martin, who is a singer and songwriter from here in Missoula. So they'll each present. After that, then, they will take questions, and we hope what happens is this will migrate into a true conversation, and Tom Benson then will facilitate that conversation. So without further ado, Raphael Chacon.
Big stage, and nobody wants to fill it. Well, hopefully we'll fill it with some big ideas tonight. All right. Well, thank you for coming out tonight. Feels like winter's just right around the corner. What I'd like to do this evening is talk broadly about the question of art and civic engagement, and from a kind of a historical philosophical perspective. So to paint a bigger picture, and I think my colleagues here tonight are going to bring it a little bit closer to home, talk more specifically about art practice, local artists, and a living art culture and civic engagement. So art used to be a moral endeavor. And I say that it used to be among the highest callings that Western civilization has produced. And I'm going to basically talk about the Western tradition here, although I think to a certain extent we could talk about this in a global context as well. The artistic profession in the West, at least since the Renaissance, has only increased in the respect that we have for artists, the stature of the individual artist as a maker or professional in the society. But along with that increase in the stature and the position of the artist in society has also come a certain responsibility. In fact, in the Renaissance, they talked about two concepts, civiltà, civility, and virtù as necessary for the artist to succeed in society. Virtù was actually civic responsibility. It sounds a little like our word virtue, but actually it translates into civic responsibility. So what we had was this notion that the artists, as long as their status was rising in the midst of everyone else, all the other noble professions, that the artists also had a responsibility to society. Art became the primary means for the diffusion of culture, the passing on of traditions, beliefs, and values, and to a certain extent ideology. So whether that was religious or political or cultural, art became a primary vehicle for the conveyance of those values from generation to generation. Therefore, art had a supremely moral responsibility in society. Now, with the advent of modernism and art for art's sake, that changed a little bit because it seemed that the debt that the artists owed society for fame and fortune, the kind of reciprocal relationship that existed there shifted a little bit, because what replaced that sense of responsibility to the culture was the concept of art for art's sake. So in the modern world, we talk about the artist having art as individual expression rather than collective expression or collective responsibility. So that, in some ways, has thrown a wrench in the history of the West, where the artist was always in service, whether we were servants to the church in the Middle Ages, putting block upon block or carving a gargoyle, or whether we were painting paintings in the Renaissance that instruct people to the true faith, that there was always a sense that we were doing something that was worthwhile for society as a whole. But now that there was this new concept out there, this aberrant concept of art for art's sake, or art as personal expression, individual expression, where I realize my innermost needs and my innermost goals and my visions for life through my art, the shift was pretty radical. That is, that the artist, in some ways, stopped being loyal to society as a whole and was really ultimately responsible to being loyal to art and loyal to the individual or individual expression. So art in the service of faith, in the service of religion, in the service of government, in the service of institutions, educational institutions, etc., was suspect in the modern age for most of the 20th century. So the avant-garde artist could assume the role then of social gadfly, that is, step aside, be a commentator or critic of culture and society, or be completely detached from society and still be true to their mission and their calling as great artists. In other words, be entirely amoral and still be true to the process of art. That's a pretty radical thing. And in spite of that, the artist could still enjoy the protections, the position, the privileges of living in society. Wow, what an amazing century to be an artist. I mean, if you think about it, you're not responsible to anyone or anything except yourself and your own art, and you could still enjoy all of the commensurate protections of the society. So, and in fact, the artists, particularly the visual artists, but we can even talk about musicians, were expected to be nonconformists, anti-establishment, anti-bourgeois, even transgressive in their isolation. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. Society allowed the artist, in fact, to be an amoral individual sort of hovering within our midst, a kind of viral creature, and that's pretty remarkable. Well, of course, the good life doesn't last forever. So postmodernism, that is this movement that has come of late, has actually swept away with those privileges and those responsibilities. In fact, the postmodernists have dismissed the individual altogether. In this kind of free, sort of Wild West that we now have intellectually and philosophically, it has allowed for certain elements of the old ways to come back. For example, artists' communal responsibility, loyalty to communities, to needs, advocacy. Those things are now back in a big way. However, there's a catch. Since there is no individual, then there is no universal truth, and there is no collective effort that we can all buy into. And that's unbelievable. So what we see is, in fact, artists who are engaged deeply in what we see as moral acts of art making, faithful acts of art making that somehow are meant to be good for society, moral acts, and yet the postmodernist dismisses them as mini attempts at local good or mini moralities rather than a true sense of morality. They say that it's impossible for an artist today to speak through art to all people across space and time. At a time when it seems that we need artists to be our social conscience, we need them to, in fact, to play that role of being the moral figure in our midst. So remember, Warhol only gave you 15 minutes of fame and fortune, and then it's over. Okay, for the U.S., for us as Americans in the United States, the question is twofold. One relates to the role of the artist. What is the proper role of the artist in our society? And the other one is the role of the state. What is the relationship between our nation, our state, and the arts? What should the proper role for the state be? And this has been a question that basically goes back to the founding of the Republic. So the first question, should our artists be moral? That is, should they strive to be integrated weavers of the social fabric in order to make society better? And that's a kind of an old paradigm. It's the oldest paradigm we have. But that's the first question. And then there are the other questions that follow. Should the artist then be immoral? That is, transgressive? Because there are some who believe that only through paradigmatic shifts, by radically changing the culture or the thought of the time, by breaking with convention, that's the only way that society really advances and grows. Okay, so the artist could either be moral or immoral, or the possibility that the artist is amoral, that is, stand apart with their loyalty solidly placed on making their own art, their own creative research, their own critical inquiry. So the status of the artist is still up for grabs, I believe, and I think every generation has to redefine that as Americans. The second part, to what degree does society as a whole, or the state, or the government, owe anything to the visual artist, or the artist in general? Okay? In other words, should your tax dollars subsidize the activities of the artistic profession? And that's ultimately, and sadly, what it often gets reduced to in this culture. In fact, we began, actually, you and I talking about the appeal. We have to constantly, haggle with Washington for those precious resources that then allow the arts to flourish or to even exist. Okay, so I want to sort of wrap up my part of this by just reading to you some quotations, and these are quotes mostly from Americans from an earlier age. And the idea behind reading you these texts is so that you see that this issue, art and civic engagement, has a history with us, a deep history with us, among thinkers and artists. And that, in fact, that the question has been pregnant for a very, very long time in our culture. So, so hopefully these quotations will, from our founding fathers, because they're all guys, unfortunately, but hopefully that these will enlighten our coming discussion, and maybe they'll inspire us, and probably they'll depress us mostly. Okay. So this is the words of Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher, from his Critique of Judgment, and this was written in 1790. I was honest when I said we'd start with Kant. Okay. We thus see that artistic genius is a talent for producing that for which no definite rule can be given. It is not mere aptitude for what can be learned by rule. Hence, originality must be its first property. 2, but since it can also produce original nonsense, its products must be models, that is, exemplary, and they consequently ought not to spring from imitation, but must serve as a standard or rule of judgment for the rest of society. Do you get the point here? The artist is, in fact, supposed to break rules, according to Immanuel Kant. Okay, to be conventional is not to be artist, but to be original is absolutely necessary for the artistic genius, and to be exemplary as an ideal for the rest of society. Okay, now let's bring it over to this side of the ocean. This is the neoclassical painter John Trumbull, and this is a letter to President Thomas Jefferson written from London on June 11th, 1789. The greatest motive I had or have for engaging in or for continuing my pursuit of painting has been the wish of commemorating the great events of our country's revolution. I am fully sensible that the profession, as it is generally practiced, is frivolous, little useful to society, and unworthy of a man who has talents for more serious pursuits. But to preserve and diffuse the memory of the noblest series of actions which have ever presented themselves in the history of man, to give to the present and the future sons of oppression and misfortune such glorious lessons of their rights and of the spirit with which they assert and support them, and even to transmit to their descendants the personal resemblance of those who have been great actors in those illustrious scenes, these are objects which give dignity to the profession. I flattered myself that by devoting a few years of life to this object, I did not make an absolute waste of time or squander useless talents from which my country might justly demand valuable service. And I feel some honest pride in the prospect of accomplishing a work of art such as had never been done before and in which it was not easy that I should have a rival. And then he goes on to say, interestingly enough, I am told that it is the custom in France for the king to be considered as a subscriber to 100 copies of all elegant works engraved by his subjects, that these are deposited in the Bibliothèque du Roi and distributed as presents to foreigners of distinction and taste as specimens of the state of the fine arts in France, Would this be a model of diffusing a knowledge of their origin and at the same time a lesson on the rights of humanity improper to be adopted by the United States? So he suggests to John Jefferson that maybe we should create a system by which the state can in fact commission works of art from artists and put them on the dole. Jefferson never answered the letter, as far as we know. Okay, from Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoughts on Art, 1841. He says, "The artist who is to produce a work which is to be admired not by his friends or his townspeople or his contemporaries, but by all men, and which is to be more beautiful to the eye in proportion to its culture, must disindividualize himself and be a man of no party and no manner and no age, but one through whom the soul of all men circulates as the common air through his lungs. In this country at this time, other interests than religion and patriotism are predominant, and the arts, the daughters of enthusiasm, do not flourish. The genuine offspring of our ruling passions we behold, popular institutions, the school, the reading room, the post office, the exchange, the insurance company, and an immense harvest of economical inventions are the fruit of the equality and the boundless liberty of lucrative callings in our nation. They are superficial wants, and their fruits are these superficial institutions. But as far as they accelerate the end of political freedom and national education, they are preparing the soil of man for fairer flowers and fruits in another age. For beauty, truth, and goodness are not obsolete. They spring eternal in the breast of man." Words of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And then Thomas Cole in 1835. "There is in the human mind an almost inseparable connection between the beautiful and the good, so that if we contemplate the one, the other seems present. And an excellent author has said, it is difficult to look at any objects with pleasure unless where it arises from brutal and tumultuous emotions, without feeling that disposition of the mind which tends towards kindness and benevolence. And surely whatever increases such a disposition by increasing our pleasures and enjoyments cannot be too much cultivated. Yet I cannot but express my sorrow that the beauty of our nation and our landscapes are quickly passing away. The ravages of the axe are daily increasing. The most noble scenes are made desolate, and oftentimes with a wantonness and barbarism scarcely credible in a civilized nation. The wayside is becoming shadeless, and another generation will behold spots now rife with beauty, desecrated by what is called improvement and progress, which as yet generally destroys nature's beauty without substituting it with art." And Henry George, writing about the city in 1898, says, "The vast population of our great cities are utterly divorced from the genial influences of nature. The great mass of them never, from year's end to year's end, press foot upon Mother Earth, or pluck a wild flower, or hear the tinkle of brooks, the rustle of grain, or the murmur of leaves as the light breeze comes through the woods. All the sweet and joyous influences of nature are shut out from them. Her sounds are drowned by the roar of the streets and the clatter of the people in the next room or the next tenement. Her sights are hidden from their eyes by rows of high buildings. Sun and moon rise and set, and in solemn procession the constellations move across the skies, but these imprisoned multitudes behold him only as a man in a deep quarry. The life of great cities is not the natural life of man. He must, under such conditions, deteriorate physically, mentally, morally." And then finally, from 1912, Daniel Burnham to the Chicago City Planners, this was written shortly, or uttered shortly before his death. "Make no little plans. They have no magic to stir men's blood, and probably themselves will not be realized. Make big plans. Aim high in hope and work, remembering that a noble, logical diagram once recorded will never die. But long after we are gone, will be a living thing, asserting itself with ever-growing insistency. Remember that our sons and our grandsons are going to do things that would stagger us. Let your watchword be order and your beacon be beauty."
those Thomas Cole pictures because it just illustrated that so beautifully. Oh well. I am going to share images of work that inspires me. And I just have it on a timer so it'll run, and I'll say whatever I can fit in the 10 seconds that the picture shows. So it's a way of really keeping me from talking too long. So I made this in Keynote and then ended up having to, I'm going to show you the PowerPoint version. I think the formatting will be okay. Great. Oh, now I can't see. I was going to take a survey of who everybody is because I recognize a few people here. So, an amazing thing about the Aboriginal artists of Australia is that there's a very compressed history. So we are able to see the rock art, the art in caves and in overhangs that relates to fertility and power relationships with animals. And then within 30 years, people move into making acrylic paintings. So the acrylic paintings that are made by the community in Yuendamu are very related to the body art, to the ritual, like this one that is unfortunately no longer being practiced, but is within the memory of living artists. And the designs that are done on the earth that are a spiritual kind of prayer in a way of keeping human beings in balance with our planet. So here's one of the wonderful artists who's finished painting, you'll see in a minute. And you notice he's working always on the floor because that's where the materials would have been laid out on the earth. So Paddy Jabulajari Sims is telling the story of his own family's relationship, origin with the earth in the dream time. And each of these paintings literally relates to a water hole. So it's a map of the earth. It's a way of passing on very important survival information. I happen to know that this Tibetan monk was just in Missoula last week, is going to be in Bozeman next week creating, in Helena, what he did was the mandala of forgiveness in the middle of the rotunda. It was very powerful, well attended, and after 4 days, he swept it all together and it dissolved in this powerful metaphor for our impermanence. So art in traditional cultures is totally related to our understanding of life and death. Here's a wonderful piece from Animating Democracy that is a continuum of civically engaged art. So an artist may be making a commentary on a social theme or a little beyond that, stimulating dialogue, and not just artists, but curators, arts educators, culture workers, humanists. And then at the upper end of the spectrum, or I could say the left end of the spectrum, is art that's intended to inspire action. So we're not just representing every different point of view as in the dialogue realm, but really trying to change people. And this is really, like Raphael was saying, this is where art originates in Western culture as well. So, for example, in the Eisenheim altarpiece, designed for people who were in the hospital being treated with the plague, there's this identification with Christ and all his gangrenous wounds, but then that going up to heaven in a glow of light. We don't even usually think of somebody like Michelangelo as being very political, but when the David was put up, it was very controversial, had to be guarded from rock throwers because it threatened the power structure of the Medici and Rome. Vincent van Gogh also very, very socially concerned in some of his early work. And of course, Keita Kollwitz is one of the most outstanding artists known for her strong anti-war work and her humanist concern. Probably the most famous piece of anti-war art is Guernica by Pablo Picasso. And so it's something that many artists refer back to again and again in our postmodern era. The existence of Yellowstone National Park as a national park is a result of the work of artists who brought Washington's attention to the value of these lands, as well as Ansel Adams, probably the most recognized photographer for his beautiful work of Yosemite, was politically motivated. Let's protect it. Jacob Riis' documentation of street children and basically homeless people, he was himself living in these conditions when coming to the United States. Or Lewis Hine, a social worker who tirelessly documented the conditions of children, child labor, to make change. So photography has a long history. Farm Security Administration Project with Dorothea Lange was one of a team of photographers that really worked to get social programs for rural people. And I love how her image of the migrant mother has disseminated and become an icon. In fact, many of the photographs that started as pure journalism, for example, in the Vietnam War, have turned into icons and archetypes in our mind and been echoed by other artists, as in this poster art and babies, which was held underneath the Guernica painting in the Museum of Modern Art as a protest against the war in Vietnam. Of course, Charles Moore documented the civil rights movement. Those images changed people's mind because they saw what was happening. So photography's played a very powerful role, and artists like Andy Warhol have kept going with that. Speaking of postmodernism, he's really reflecting on how the media has shaped our consciousness. The Andy Warhol Museum, I've got a couple of examples of interesting exhibitions they mounted in order to stimulate dialogue. One on the issue of capital punishment, in which all sides were represented and the electric chair images were shown, but programming really attempted to emphasize and get people thinking. This is a really intense series. Without Sanctuary, a collection of lynching photographs which were shown there, and programming that went with it. Laura Nelson was a woman who was hung in Oklahoma, and this particular image has had an impact on us here. I'll show an example. Fred Wilson, Mining the Museum, juxtaposing artifacts from museums to really make us think and get us comparing how we care for things and present them, and what does it say about ourselves. Very interesting contemporary artist, one that's featured in the Art 21 series. And of course, few of us in the arts will ever forget the controversy around this particular piece by Chris O'Feely, in which, so you see why I have to have it on the time. You all remember that. Fernando Botero is probably the most respected Colombian artist, and I was really shocked when he took on the Abu Ghraib images, because he's been an artist who I hadn't seen a lot of political work from until this time, but it really does show you the world perspective kind of spinning in relation to the release of those photographs. I found the paintings really hard to look at. Oh, one of the most inspiring artists to me, Krzysztof Wodiczko, Polish-born, living in the U.S. now, designed this. It's like an RV for homeless people, with cooking and washing and sleeping, and can be pushed through the streets and really make a difference in people's lives. So I love that creative application. And this is, I think, some of the most important civic dialogue work. This piece projected at the memorial for the A-bomb in Hiroshima, and here's one, the Tijuana Project. This was a live piece where people told about their traumas, the women that worked in the maquiladoras. Guillermo Gomez Peña and Coco Fusco, of course, performance artists that really force us to question our perceptions of the other. And in this particular piece, Gomez Peña was dramatizing issues faced by immigrants. Suzanne Lacey in this piece is emphasizing how we need to listen to older women. And so that's what the people are doing. Of course, one of the most famous pieces, the AIDS quilt, very popular, very well-known, having had a huge impact on consciousness raising is interesting. And Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial. She was only 21 and an undergraduate student when this piece was chosen. Thank goodness it was a blind jury, because she never would have gotten it. Here in Montana, thanks to Jane Wagner Deschner, Adrian Arleo, and Phoebe Toland were two of the artists that listened to the stories of people who survived illness. The Bread and Puppet Theater in Vermont really brought giant puppets into the political performance realm and has inspired a whole host of other puppet theaters. La Caravana Arcoiris, this is actually Penelope Vaquero, whose paintings will open at Bernice's at First Friday, and another Caravana image. Jason Gutzmer is also a Missoula artist who's worked with this traveling group through South America. And here's a current one, actually just earlier this month. How many of you saw these images? Wow. Amazing giant puppets. And the little Lilliputians here, the Royal Deluxe Puppet Theater from France. So this is on the 20th anniversary of the breakdown of the Berlin Wall and the reunification. And so the big giant is looking for his little niece. That they were separated by the wall. And so for a series of days, they're moving through Berlin. 1.5 million people in the audience over time. So that's a phenomenal kind of audience, which says to me, really, we need to take art to the people and to the streets. And I feel there is a great civic responsibility for artists, that if we expect that support, we also have, I think, obligations of relevance. And we all love stories. It's the human story that draws us in and opens our heart. Amina Robinson is amazing. She's a MacArthur Fellow from Columbus, Ohio, and she tells the Crowman tales. The Crowman is the griot, the storyteller of the community, and she is so prolific. She's made 2,000 books telling the story of Poindexter Village, which was built in Blackberry Patch, the African-American community of Columbus that got a federally subsidized housing. And so she's just sewn it all together. She's totally devoted to her place and telling that story. If you have a voice from a community that's been marginalized, simply telling your story is an important political act. Oh, this was taking guns and melting them down and creating manhole covers. I love that. So here's a transformation project that consumed me for a few years. Speaking Volumes, Transforming Hate, which opened at the Holter Museum, utilized 3,500 books by Ben Clausen, who thought Hitler was the hero, and they're white supremacist hate books that were transformed by over 100 artists. Ariana Boussard-Rifle, who grew up in Arlee, and you can see several pieces in the installation, which 1/3 of the artists were from Montana. It was a combination of invitational and juried exhibition. Clarissa Sly, one of my heroines, it was hard to send her that box of books. And it was hard for her to open it because her uncle had been lynched. But she created this beautiful crown. And then she came to Montana for 2 months. And she worked with our students in Helena and did a residency at the Montana Artists Refuge and really shared her story. Jean Grosser took images from relatives who died in the Holocaust and created a series of memorials that are just, very, very direct, very heartfelt and strong, I think. Of course, the authors of these books and the followers, which are now called the Creativity Movement, you may have heard, have become very active in Bozeman and Billings. There's actually a counter demonstration on Sunday in Bozeman. Lee Curtis, Miguel Guillen, a gay artist in Seattle, is really looking at how hate is passed on generationally with his cookies. And so the whole Boussard-Rifle family worked on this house, and thank goodness it used up every last book. The Montana Human Rights Network was so happy because they had acquired the books. It's a long story, you may have heard. But the show will be here in January. So you get a chance to see some selections from the show. Jean Quick to See Smith collaborated with her son Neil. Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes is a huge piece, 24 photographs relating to the historic educational program, Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes. And Betty Saar, another one of my heroines. This is an important piece. You know, when kids come into the show, they haven't seen this before. Or maybe none of us have really meditated on that enough. Richard Notkin, of course, a Helena artist, and you see references here to Guernica. And Lisa Jarrett, who is here in our midst, wonderful, wonderful artist, gave us this triptych and came over and did a residency. She's coming back to Helena to teach again. There's Laura Nelson. Laura Nelson was hung with her teenage son because the vigilante believed that her husband, who was killed, also had stolen a cow. Laura Nelson appears again in this beadwork piece. I cried when I opened that. And of course, you all know Steve Glukert. This is the rat race, when you turn the crank, the black rat and the white rat are in a race. Nobody wins. The black rat has a chain. And Nick Cave also using the target in his piece Profiling. This whole exhibition was really an opportunity to process a lot of our shared history, experience. Everybody has stories about their experiences. So it was a really exciting dialogue opportunity. Sarah Steele's painting based on the peace cranes that the children made with her in Philadelphia. So they're very beautiful pieces, transformative pieces. It was really an exciting exhibition to work on. It's traveling for 2.5 years. So in Bozeman now, here next, and then to Billings. Valerie Hellerman, who runs the Tibetan Children's Education Foundation, is inspired by the monks, the Tibetan monks who are very compassionate and forgiving. And wrapping up with Jane Wagner Deschner, she knitted hats for the books because she thought the white supremacists didn't get enough love and caring as children. So I did put a couple of my own pieces in here. I feel I'm here as a humanist, but I am an artist and very concerned with these same issues in my work. Cool Water Hula, 10 years ago. How many of you were there? Yay. Happening again. Christy Hager's here with us, and she's working with Judy Fiel to revive the Cool Water Hula, which was performed by 150 women and 10 men, 1 baby on the edge of the Berkeley pit. The hula is a prayer for clean water. It was so beautiful, and I think one of the most powerful art actions that got a great deal of national attention and is scheduled to be revived on the 10th anniversary, July 10 this year. So talk to Christy and start practicing. This is Sinuve, the giant Mother Earth goddess that a collaborative group of artists is working on. And Sinuve is starting to practice the hula. She will be there. She's starting to get it. It's a little challenging, but as we create Sinuve in collaboration, we also think about what do we want in a goddess. So it's a deeply communally, collaboratively spiritual process to think about what do we want to say for the earth at this time. I think you all know that we're living in a very critical moment, and it's really time to raise our voices and make ourselves heard, and we thought maybe a great big Mother Earth goddess puppet would help. So that's a little survey.
Well, my name is Amy Martin, and I'm really, really so happy I got asked to be part of this. I had no idea how much I needed this night until I heard Raphael's first few sentences, and I was like, oh, because I think that I have been living in these questions ever since I started living as an artist, and I'm really in the thick of them. I just want to throw out a few questions, and then I want to talk a little bit just about my own journey and then try and hook it back up with the bigger issues. I felt like Raphael pointed out the whole question of art as a moral act, and if it's moral, what is it? What is the guiding morality? What are we moral to? What are we loyal to? I feel like that's a huge question, and that we're all still grappling with, even though we like to pretend in our modern culture that it's not. And I think in addition to, or maybe the predecessor of religion and the state, I feel like the big missing hole in how we're thinking about that now is the corporation or the dollar, which is claims so much of our lives and so much of our artistic and creative attention. I had a workshop this summer where I learned some singing in the African American tradition, including roots in Africa itself, and out of that I came out with the question of how did art ever get separated from the duty and the responsibility that Raphael was talking about and that Katie was demonstrating in all this great work? How did we ever sever those things? And why is it so hard to knit them back together now? When they cultures all over the world, it's natural, it's normal. Art is supposed to relate and be part of and be responsible to society. I have a feeling probably a lot of you maybe know the answer to that question, but I don't, and I'm puzzled, continually puzzled. I feel like a question that looms really large for me personally, both in terms of what I'm actually trying to do and also how maybe I need to be able to speak about or explain to people about what I'm trying to do, is how do we make art that does have a morality or loyalties in it that isn't perceived as art that is just propaganda? Or how do we become artists that are trying to have that sense of responsibility and not be just perceived as somebody's lackey? Because we're so used to that. We're so used to everybody working for somebody and everybody pushing an agenda. And there's been a lot of really crappy art made that is propaganda. I mean, the straight up like propaganda from the state to, I'm loving it, or whatever the current McDonald's thing, you know what I mean? And so people have reason to be suspicious. But I think the problem is that we're so used to that we almost can't see something now that does have a morality and loyalty to it without immediately thinking like somebody's just trying to promote their little, private agenda. And it's like we don't even know how to think about art that, like the demonstration that Katie gave. But I do think the art itself, in a way, transcends that problem. And then, last question before I kind of launch into a little bit of my personal stuff is, how do we actually get art that has a loyalty and morality to it done? How do we actually do it and survive as artists? I mean, I think it's really hard to figure out how to survive as an artist anyway. I mean, if you just want to, in my field, I'm a musician, if you want to be a big superstar musician, that's like a hard enough nut to crack, but there's sort of a path laid out for you to some extent, or at least there used to be before Napster. But if you are trying to be an artist and that's not what you want, but you know that you want to be an artist, it's a little bit of a wilderness. And particularly, how do we do it not just as individuals, but how do we do it together in a way that is, has a chance to actually impact the culture at a broader level and push us to be the best artists we can be. So I'm not an academic, and so I am going to kind of do a little bit more of personal stuff maybe than the other two speakers, but hopefully it will have some relevance to you too. I think that last question is one that I'm just continually flummoxed by and grappling with, and it's really actually kind of a relief to feel it crystallize even just here tonight of like, oh yeah, that's my question, and it's okay to have that question and not know the answer. I think the very first song that I ever wrote, I was living in Ecuador, for this summer. I was taking an intensive Spanish language and culture course over the course of 9 weeks when I was in college. And I had gotten a guitar for Christmas that was very old and crappy. And I knew like 4 chords on it, but I took it with me to Ecuador because I just loved it so much and I loved playing and I just felt like I was going to need it. And I did. And I played all the time and I developed, I gained a lot while I was there just by desperately needing to play it all the time. And there was a time I was walking home from my class, and I'm this, Iowa farm girl out in Ecuador and feeling pretty excited about life, and I must have been 19, and I had, of course, my shoes were fine and my clothes were fine, and I was getting to be there, and I'd worked for 3 summers beforehand earning money so I could be there, and I really was appreciating every day of it, and this woman and I'd seen plenty of other people like this while I was there, but it just somehow stopped me in my tracks. There was a woman who was walking down the street towards me, and we brushed arms as we went by, and I was watching her, and she couldn't have been older than me. She might have been younger than me, and she was walking like this because she had a huge stack of wood on her back, and she was wearing traditional Ecuadorian native clothes, which were gorgeous, and she looked like she maybe had 20 years left in her life, just from the way her face looked and the way her body looked, even though I could tell that she was young. And I just didn't know what to do with that moment of awareness of like, I'm a college kid from the United States in Ecuador, and you have every right that I have to an education, to being able to learn and explore and do anything you want to do and eat all the food that you could possibly eat and, all of that. But you are living this way and I am living this way. And how does this make sense? And so I went back to my home stay where I was living and wrote a song. And it was frankly a pretty bad song, but it was really passionate, and it was so important to me because I needed art in that moment to make sense out of what was going on. Or if not to make sense out of it, at least to somehow have a vehicle for digesting it. And then I came back and I did my little talks at like the Rotary Club and at my grandma's, reading book or book circle. And I always sang that song because it was my way of communicating the complexity of this moment. I don't necessarily think it did a great job, but I was trying. And I guess I'm telling that story because I think it is still so natural to us as human beings. Just because our culture doesn't say that art is supposed to question and connect us to societal issues, I just think it's so natural to so many of us that that's what we need it for. And I wrote those kinds of songs, and I wrote the heartbreaky, I'm in love with my boyfriend songs, and I wrote about my cats and all kinds of crazy stuff. And to me, it was just all my songs. And then when I came and started playing music out in the world for people, more than just my family and Grandma's Book Club, people were saying things in like, nice reporters and people that would come to shows to try and give me a little bit of press would say things like, so tell me about your political work and tell me about what it's like to be a political musician. And then, okay, so now I'm answering that question. And so then somebody's like, oh, she's a political musician, so let's have her come play at this rally, which I was great with. I was like, awesome, let's get more music and rallies. And, but this thing started happening where I started to develop an identity as a political artist. And I fought it, and there's a part of me that still does fight it because I'm like, I still feel, even though all the evidence is pointing in a different direction, I still feel like that's just an artist. Like, it doesn't have to have a subset. And I feel like, it's a little bit the same thing with the woman artist, you know what I mean? Like, why do we have to put these labels on ahead of time? I mean, I don't think it's ever coming at me with or very rarely coming at me with like a bad intention, but it just, what makes me want to fight is that there's something in me that feels like it doesn't fit. It just doesn't feel like it tells enough of the story, because I still can sense the Aboriginal artist in me that's like, that's just what we do. That's what we do as artists. And so I want to define, I want everyone else to redefine their definition rather than me having to adjust. I guess I wanted just to talk a little bit too about that question of how do we do this and survive, because I think I felt, all along that there was and I still feel like there's something in my calling that has to do with this very issue of art as civic engagement. And I've tried to manifest it in different ways, in songs themselves, like the one I just told you about, and plenty of other ones too. And also just in the process of making art. I made a CD, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I was so disturbed by the stories of what was happening in Afghanistan with the Taliban. And I'm disturbed all over again. But it was fresh news to me at that point, and I just kind of couldn't get it out of my mind. And I was just feeling, that sense of responsibility of like, I have all this entitled power. I have enough to eat. I'm a woman who has gotten to have an education. And here are all these women in this country that are just suffering, and like, we've got to do something, right? And I want to make songs, and I want to make music, and I didn't want to make an album of music that was all about the Taliban, because I didn't know that much about it. And you're always supposed to write what you know, and I'd never been there, and I wasn't going to get to go anytime soon, and I felt like it would be bad. It would not be good art. And I had all of these other songs I wanted to put out, and so I was like, okay, I'm concerned about this issue. I had one song about that whole situation. Is there some way that I can get some art out, get some art made, do something that makes some sort of statement or raises some awareness about this situation, and maybe even raises some money about it? So I just threw it out there on email. Does anybody want to contribute to me making a CD? And in exchange for your contribution, I'm going to give away every dime that comes back from the CD to these 2 women's groups in Afghanistan that I'd researched and made some connections with. And I think I can do it for, I think it was like $5,000. Anybody interested? And people contributed. And then at the last hour, I was like $1,000 short, and I didn't know if I could keep my recording dates. And then I went to my mailbox, and somebody had sent me a $1,000 check. So it was like a whole bunch of people that had gave like $10 or $20, and then this one person who gave $1,000, who was amazing. And then I gave all the money. I had a goal of raising $10,000 from the CD, and I gave all that money away. And I was thinking as I was doing this, like, this is really weird, because I would be at a show performing, and I was really glad I'd made the CD and everything. But then I needed like gas money to get to the next show, and people would be buying the CDs, and I'd be like thinking, wow, if people only buy that CD, I actually can't get to my next venue. But if they buy this other one, then I can. And I guess I'm only bringing up these nitty-gritty kind of ugly details because I think it's kind of what it comes down to for artists, is it's like, I did this thing I was proud of. I think I'm still glad I did it. I don't know if it was perfectly well thought out. Clearly it wasn't perfectly well thought out. But it was an attempt, it was an attempt to try and connect this desire to make art with this desire to make a difference, and without the art becoming propaganda, and but it left me in a weird spot, and it just personally and financially, and it left me still with the question of like, okay, so now I did that, now I still want to make more music, how do I do it? And I've done other projects too, but I'll just mention one more and wrap it up. And not last year, the year before, I was talking to Bryony Schwan, who runs the Biomimicry Institute, which is a great organization here in Missoula. And for purposes of tonight, I'll just say it's an environmental organization. And she was telling me about all the amazing things they did, and she said, we've really got to find a way to get some of the concepts of biomimicry out into the culture more broadly, and especially with children. And I was so turned on by all these different ideas, and I said off the cuff, I could make a CD about that. And then I went out for a run, and I was running and writing songs in the Rattlesnake, and completely blissing out and feeling like, oh, not only could I'm going to, and we're going to start now. And so I marched back up to Bryony's office all sweaty like a half an hour later, and I was like, let's do this. And she amazingly said yes and made it happen and got the funding. And I was a little smarter this time. I was like, this is what I need to do my part, and you can do this other part, and I don't need to own the CD. You guys can do what you need to do with the CD, use it to raise money in your own way. And it's turned into this really the coolest collaboration I've ever had, where I ended up starting a kids choir that's now ongoing, and I completely love them, the Missoula Coyote Choir, and we decided that we weren't just going to make a CD, we were going to be involved in the whole process of trying to get the biomimicry concepts out, and we did a tour of elementary schools around Missoula and talked about it, and now every year as we go on, we choose another service project for the year. And so I'm trying to teach these kids and through them learn myself how to think about art and civic engagement as the same thing from the get-go. And it just reinforces my gut feeling that this is natural. This is natural part of being a human being, because these kids don't need to be told like theories of, why you should try and use art to be responsible in society. They're just like, we love to sing. We care about penguins. What are we going to do? You know what I mean? And it's like, it's so natural, and it's so inspiring. I'm learning from them all the time, but I am still left with these questions, and at the same time, I'm continually inspired, because even though it's not maybe the officially sanctioned or recognized inside the box version of music or art that's out there, or theater, or literature, anything, it's so happening, as Katie demonstrated. It's happening all the time, and it seems to me like we're really ripe for one of those paradigm shifts where we go from thinking that this thing that's on the margins that we sort of pay attention to, we can return it to the center, and it isn't. I don't think that it doesn't exclude anything. It's not like, oh, if you're going to make art that is trying to be concerned with global warming, that you can't also write a song about, the night you had last night partying at the Union Club. Like, you can do all those things, and I don't think we have to separate them in the other direction either, which is sometimes maybe what happens. It's like, I am not going to write one love song, or I refuse to talk about it, have any kind of confessional personal expression in my art, because that's what, those passe other people do. And I just think it's silly on both sides, and I think that there are ways to knit it all together, but I am still confused about how. And I guess I just want to leave with this question that I think about so often is, what if all of this amazing creative power that we have as human beings, I mean, it's really our special gift. We're not that fast, and we don't have very sharp claws. We can't hold our breath underwater for, hours, anything cool like that. All that we've got is this creative power. We are generators of ideas and new concepts and stuff and beauty. And what if all of that, or let's not even go for that, what if 20% of that was attached to and harnessed to some common goals again? And maybe we needed to swing this far away from the church and the state to get back to something that's a little bit more, that feels more authentic and maybe more diverse. Maybe, the question is that we all know now, or I think a lot of us know now, that we don't need to just only make art to celebrate a Christian God. And we don't only need to make art to celebrate, like, the Soviet Union or something, or the United States. But maybe it's loyalties that we need, and not just a loyalty. But what if just a fraction of our creative power was going towards that? All of the people who spend time figuring out how to make styrofoam better and cheaper. All of the people who are right now designing the coolest, fastest, sexiest bomb. All of us who are struggling every day just to survive and ending up in our circumstances where we end them up. Nobody wakes up when they're 10 years old and is like, I want to be part of a system that really oppresses people, But it's where we end up. Because that's where the opportunities lie, and people need to survive. And so what if there was something that happened in our system, and I don't know what and how to get there, where those same people with all that genius could be using it to help solve world hunger, could be using it to preserve endangered species, could be using it to think about global warming in new ways. I just think all of these societal discussions and conversations that we have are so often so dry and so unoriginal and so like program, yeah, budget, blah, blah, blah. And nobody listens because it's boring, and it also feels dead. And I think the reason why it does feel boring and dead is because there's no art in it and there's no artists in it. So that's my hope. Thanks.
Well, wow. There's a lot to chew on with all this. First of all, we can chat for a little while. We've got this table up here, but I think we've got a small enough group. I think we could just sort of have a discussion here with all of you, and then afterwards we can, when we get tired of sitting, we can go out to the lobby and continue this where we have alcohol. Hope that helps. Before I go on, I want to thank Ken for approaching us back a couple of months ago and reminding me that it was Arts and Humanities Month, and maybe we should collaborate and do something. And so that's where the impetus of this came from. And I also want to congratulate Ken and Kim on they just got through their biggest gig of the year, the Festival of the Book, and they did a wonderful job with that. So. Well, the thing that impressed me right off the bat is that with all three of you, there's just an intense passion about what you do and about what you study and what it means for society and the potential, the history and the potential. And so I was trying to come up with a big question to start things off, and really I go back to Raphael, your discussion about the history, and it seems like there's a bit of a parallel between the growth of political and personal freedom and what the artist does. The artist was, according to what you were saying, the artist was speaking for conventionality very often and promoting the state or the religion or whatever. And with the growth of personal and political freedom, the artist has had the freedom to be apolitical or anti-political or whatever. Does this make it more difficult for the artist in your mind than it has been? Is it more difficult to be an artist in our society now than it was up to a few hundred years ago?
Well, I think in some ways it's nice to have both in Amy and Katie's presentations, the evidence is right there that the artist will do it regardless. And I love that. I mean, the wellspring, the passion that you were talking about is there in our artistic class, our professions. So regardless of the circumstances, I mean, we saw an image of Kata Kolbitz. I mean, she was drawing in the most abject, horrific circumstances when her sons and her husband and the men in her family were in fact carnage for a huge war machine. She lived through 2 world wars and saw her country devastated by both of them. And so I think the artist will instinctively, it's like water running down a mountain. I mean, the goals of creation are there, the desire is there. The question, I think, falls on the other foot. To what extent is the culture as a whole embracing, open, accepting, nurturing of that, and in fact allowing for more than just a very small sliver of society, in fact, to exert themselves creatively. I think in some ways it was a lot harder to be a political artist. No offense, I'm looking at you. It was a lot harder to be a political artist 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, or 40 years ago, when in fact artists were not supposed to be political, where they were supposed to be disinterested, where they were supposed to be disconnected from politics and ideology. Today, one of the silver linings of the postmodern age is in fact that artists can be political, can advocate for causes, can stand up for clean water, can actually believe in causes, and can actually use the visual arts to engage community in a way that would have been poo-pooed, in the modernist age. And so in some ways, it's a little bit easier to do that.
But I think as you heard from Amy in her conversation, it's not easy in practical terms. And if you don't feel that the society is along with you, if you suspect, in fact, that the society is looking at you askance, like, oh, there's the crazy artist again, or there are these, radical fringe elements in society, rather than this is what we should all be doing, exerting our creativity and, in fact, transforming our society through creativity and with creativity, then I think we still have issues. We still have problems to work out. And I think our society, as you rightly said earlier, okay, if religion and the state are no longer there, and actually it's questionable that they were ever there in this country for the visual arts. I mean, maybe the Dorothea Lange image is evidence of a time when Washington thought, hey, maybe, there's a proper role for the state to, in fact, promote culture and art. If the state, if we know that the big institutions aren't there for the artists, then what else is left? And I think the evidence from both of my colleagues' presentations is that it's everywhere. Communities everywhere are finding their way to doing this, and they will do it, come hell or high water. Come resources or no resources. Come no funding from Washington or funding from Washington. And I mean, that doesn't mean we should just sit back and expect it to happen naturally, because there's a lot of work that it entails in order to even just start programs, in order to even bring the smallest art program to a rural school or even an inner city school. So it doesn't let us off the hook. But I don't know, I have a lot of faith that it's there, and but what we need to do is continue to nurture it. I mean, it's really the responsibility is on those of us who are not artists. Long-winded conversation.
Yeah.
I'm just curious from you and also some of the other people in the audience to me I don't feel as an artist like I'm poo-pooed necessarily. It's more just that I'm invisible. It's like the only art that, which is sort of a different thing. It's not like, oh, you're annoying. It's just kind of like, because like the only creative expression that gets seen are like people who work for marketing companies, and I guess and it's not even, I want to be sort of seen and included as like a functioning, valuable member of society. But if I can't have that, can I at least just have a salary to do what I want to do? That's what seems so odd to me, is that there's just this enormous hole that it just feels like a black hole, like no light escapes from, where, Christy and Leslie and I all go back to our little places and do our little thing, and you and Katie and then something. But there's this huge missing question of like this fabric in society that's there to actually make that art happen. And I don't know. I don't necessarily need a ton of big credit or kudos. I just kind of want to be able to do what I want to do. I'm curious what you guys think.
I thought that that was critical, is how do you do what you will do. I don't know if I think of myself as immoral, amoral, or moral. I just think that any place on that spectrum, you can say, well, somebody would call me immoral, but I would say I'm answering a higher morality or another level of morality, and you just think I'm an idiot. So I don't think about that. I just sort of assume that my intentions are good, and then but how do I survive? And with the water hula, it isn't really. It isn't the only thing I've done, but it was sort of like going to the moon, and so. In that situation, I found it really very hard to find funding, because it wasn't, the state wasn't going to go for it. How could you explain this to legislators? This, environmental groups, I was way too woo-woo for environmental groups. And then, and then for private foundations, I didn't have, disabled, disadvantaged, racial diversity. These are all the things that private foundations want you to prove that you're doing sort of artist as social worker. So I just had to go for private persons, people. And then I had to find a 501(c)(3) to sponsor, to be an umbrella for me. That's not easy either. So I think what Amy is saying, I feel like I've lived through a period of time where I don't feel like artists have been really put on a pedestal except for celebrity artists. And we're just sort of discretionary funding, in a way. So I've been speaking, Leslie and I talk about this a lot. An ongoing topic, but where does the I don't think we can expect this support to come from government, and private foundations definitely all have their little niche of what they're trying to help, and so it's I don't have an answer. I just know it's always a struggle, and have a lot of. I think that's nice to hear Amy talk about it, because you do feel kind of invisible and yet important.
Can I just say one thing? I mean, I think of what you're saying about that invisibility or lack of attention, basically, is that the bigger problem is that the popular culture doesn't care. And I think there is this huge division in the country between sort of the cultural community and the cultural life, and then the stuff that's being dictated by the corporations sort of insidiously behind forming people's taste and desires and how they spend their time. And so it's like we're in a different universe. And so people aren't going to be putting money towards that or helping themselves.
I think what we keep hearing is this idea that we live in a society that's fragmented
Yeah.
along all these lines. And then what the artist tries to do is to reconnect the glues. I love the fact that you started with these Aboriginal paintings, because I think we in the West, in the post-industrial, postmodern West, what we long for is a world in which art is central to what we do. It helps us define our place in the universe. It gives meaning to our lives. Where the artist is both shaman and social worker and healer and minister and preacher and healer, the works. Where art is not relegated to discretionary income or frivolity, as Mr. Trumbull said or whatever, but where art is central to what we do as a society and as a culture, where it affords us to be fully human. And I think that's really only what artists are crying for. They want that recognition, rather than the invisibility or this kind of alienated universe where we're all just sort of floating around trying to find some kind of meaning other than McDonald's.
I just wanted to contribute to that I know that it does seem very much like the corporate community and the artists are two very distinct units, but what I'm seeing sold in general to the public is this idea of the authentic experience. So that idea of like the McDonald's logo or slogan, or Gap jeans just had their new, their comeback in 1969, this throwback to I don't know if it's even a throwback, but the 60s weren't all that peaceful, 69. But I don't think that it's so much that there is no ability for conversation. I just think we don't know how to bridge the gap. In other words, I don't think that, I like to compare myself with my sister because we're very different. We're minded in a completely different way. I'm an artist, and she's absolutely not that. She's a model. And so she has a completely different perspective on consumerism and what's being sold to the public and how it's received and why. And ultimately, we both want the same things. We just go about it in very different ways. And what I find when I talk to individual people is that the expectation for somebody's experience is so far from what we think it is. So in other words, I don't think I can identify with you because I don't write songs, for example. But when you tell me your story, I can relate to that. I have a story very similar. It just doesn't involve music. And so for me, I think the question is how we get these seemingly disparate entities to communicate. How do we get funding from corporate sponsors that doesn't dictate what our work is going to be, or the fact that we might want to critique their contribution? It's a similar thing to be funded by the government. If you're funded by the government, you're then expected to uphold that. Are you expected to be moral and uphold that structure, or is Are you considered amoral if you critique that structure? Or, so I don't think it's hopeless. I'm very much like Raphael. I have a sense of hope about it. But I also share Amy's sentiment of confusion on how you really go about it. And so, I mean, it's an indicator, just who's here this evening. I was here, 2 weeks ago for a lecture by Roger Shimomura, and it was a packed house. And we're talking about art and civic engagement. And, so how do you raise that awareness to a level where people in the community consider the ideas that an artist is upholding just as valuable as the work?
And I just want to say too that I'm also not at all hopeless. I'm a little befuddled, and I've had moments of hopelessness, but I actually am kind of excited in some ways in the sense that I feel like maybe this is the work of artists living today, is to figure out how to do our work. And it's sometimes it's a little tiresome of like, I'd rather just do my work. I'd rather have a system in place that allows me to do it. But maybe that there's a way that by addressing that very question through the process of art making itself, that we can start to knit those things back together, because it ain't gonna get fixed by, McDonald's.
Right.
But I also don't think it's not gonna get fixed by the corporate world or the average man on the street. They're not going to not attend to it because there's no interest there, because they aren't just people that have that natural pull towards art. They could all be artists themselves. It's just that somehow we've landed in this weird place where we don't have a system. It's like we want to raise a baby, but we completely don't have any idea, how to do the first thing. And so I think you're right that there's a lot of room for cross, conversation.
I also think historically this is not a new frustration.
Yeah.
I mean, you started with the Renaissance, and I don't think this is a new issue, that this, cyclically goes on in our cultures. When you mentioned advertising, the newest Levi jeans commercial is an incredible piece of film, very compelling, very apocalyptic, and it has an original recording of Walt Whitman reading in the background, a poem. Now, no one feels more marginalized as an artist in this society than poets do, I can tell you. And here is this very moving thing. Yes, it's being used to sell Levi jeans, but it is art entering into awareness and many, many more minds than any of us will ever reach. And I think one way of looking at this issue of frustration that all of us feel is, okay then, how do we just move it 90 degrees, I mean, it's not that it's not there and not of interest, or Levi's wouldn't have made this very expensive ad. Obviously they thought that poem was moving for people. So how do we do that sort of work from a much less funded level?
Well, one of the, sorry.
Oh, I just wanted to also bring all of those questions into a really local and even hyper-local to this room level of how do these things apply to us right now in Missoula? What the organizations that are even represented in this room, a lot of people are seeking the answers to these questions. I know that there's a large group of people who are involved in the arts that I don't see, that aren't represented in this room that share these concerns, but I know that these two worlds don't necessarily overlap very often. And my particular interest right now, just why I'm interested in this conversation happening in Missoula, and why I also kind of expected that it might not be a large crowd, is because people aren't, or it doesn't seem, and so this is partly a question, like does this seem, just as far as the place that we're in also, not just the time and the cultural location of like the internet and mass culture and all of that, but like Missoula and where we're at in our cultural development regarding the arts, do we have a particular quandary to solve too that's just very local, where
there's groups of people that are all kind of asking the same question. And I'm interested in figuring out how to bring those heads together. And, you know, as much as we want to try to solve the big, big picture, you know, too, and we should be thinking about those things, I think we do have a lot of power within the people who do work for the arts in Missoula and the artists themselves to be an unusual place, if we want to, that does value the arts in a different way maybe than another city. And maybe we are that, maybe we aren't that. Maybe we in this room just think we're that, you know? But the funny thing about the jeans that I just thought though, it was kind of like that glass half full, half empty thing. You could also say that the jeans are selling the Walt Whitman poem. And that's an interesting thing to think about.
Except Walt didn't buy the ad.
But I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that at all in this room, but
I suppose that I will. I believe that we're at a point where everything is utterly fractured, and the degrees in which we're going to get closer is small. And we're going to make these small connections, and within this room, there will be something that 5 of us think is a really good thing to be funded, but everyone else really disagrees. And we're never going to all agree on one thing, but we're going to make lots of small decisions together in lots of small groups, and eventually we'll grow. And there's large organizations right now that people are looking at from the outside and being like, no, that's not so good, but we're just going to take little steps to get there. I think that that's a place that we're at because we're utterly fractured.
Well, we are living in an era of a great deal of isolation and alienation, and that's partly a result of our relationship with media and luxury. The fact that we don't live 10 people to a room. You know, I mean, I've been hosted in homes where 10 people do sleep in the same room, and there's a whole different level of inclusion and embrace and relationship. Not to say that's ideal, that people should live like that at all, but you know, in my fumbling along this path, which, you know, I've been on as an artist for a long, long time, I find a great deal of meaning in collaboration. I don't think we can solve these problems individually. It's a very lonely process, and there are certain kinds of intellectual freedom that are only achieved during periods of deep reflection and contemplation, like we do find in our creative process in our studios. But I do think there is a fallacy in that modernist ideal of the individual genius, that there is no solution in that. As much as I would like the luxury of as much studio time as I would like, you know, there's meaning for me in being with my students. And some of my most interesting projects, like what I heard Amy describing, have been collaborations with other groups, working in solidarity with those that share the same kind of values and goals. Because I think we have some very serious work to do in this world if the people are going to continue to populate the planet.
Well, that's really the words you used. We have serious work to do in this world. I think that gets to the one thing that is, when I listen to this discussion, the thing that I worry about the most is the idea that, you know, here we are in a time where, as you say, we're increasingly isolated, and we're asked less and less to commit to things. We're asked less and less to really throw our weight behind things. Mm-hmm. And the kind of art that all of you are talking about today demands much more of the viewer than it demands something more than appreciation. You know, you don't just have to say, my God, that is beautiful. You have to say, you know, that's beautiful and I understand it, and now I move to action. You have to move through that little diagram we saw. And the thing that I worry about is that the fact that asks so much more of the viewer, is that a stumbling block that we can actually get across when, you know, when the general trend in our society seems to be toward things that don't ask that. And there seems to be a lot of it out there that doesn't ask that of the viewer, and it's good stuff too. I mean, there's really interesting things for people to do. So that, I mean, that's my worry.
Just to kind of respond to that, I think that art has always demanded a great deal from us. It's just that for way too long, for most of human history actually, that art has been restricted to, at least in the Western world, a few elites who had access to it and understood what was going on. You know, the rest of them be damned. It doesn't matter if they had art in their lives. But we live in a democratic society. We live under this pretense or this hope that art is in fact, that enriches all of our lives and should enrich all of our lives and should have a proper place in all of our lives. So it's not so much that the art has become more obscure, which it has, and more harder to grasp and understand. Yes, that is true. But it's also the fact that we also expect most of us to have some sense of appreciation and understanding beyond that. Yes, to that.
I just think there's a real disparaging gap between pure art and economics. And that gulf is just really insurmountable in so many ways. And even historically, we talk about these great artists who were supported in the Renaissance. And you know, we say that very easily, but we don't really even know how many other really good or better artists were around because they weren't funded. And you know, they didn't get the church to back them for whatever reason. And you know, we have similar problems today. And you know, I don't know that that's a bad thing. If we all got funded, how would that work?
Well, I definitely don't think it can come down to the scrappy fights over the grant dollars from the Arts Council or whatever. Because those competitions for those funds, I feel like are I mean, I'm not go Arts Council, give money away, and you have to do it the way you want to do it. But I guess I feel like really what's needed is like such a deeper infrastructure change, so that then it doesn't have to become a question of like, well, what if we all got funded? It would be more of like, what if what art was back integrated into daily life? And so, you know, I mean, what if there was like a middle class of artists instead of
part of the problem today is we're inundated by art, if you will. I mean, people that write sitcoms believe they are artists.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, we get that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we're inundated. And everything we do, from our telephones to our art is...
I do think, in some way, what you're saying is that we are closer to the reality you just described than we've ever been as a culture, in that there are a lot of middle-class graphic artists, writers, and the problem is we don't like the stuff. I know, but I mean, isn't it true that in some ways, I'm being devil's advocate,
No, it's a great question.
but more people are making a living making art right now than ever have in society, ever. I think that's probably true. I don't know.
But that artist who is working on the sitcom or the graphic, you know, designing newsletters for the bank or whatever,
Right.
which I have done, or I was the text person actually, but I did that for a long time. The difference is that they're not going into a room and closing a door and saying, what is my creative inspiration today and how am I going to manifest it? And they're definitely not saying, what are the problems that society is facing today that matter to me and what is my artistic response to that? They're saying, I mean, I remember what I've said, I mean, I still do it sometimes. It's like, well, somebody needs a story about the free gift you give me with your checking account. Now, you can write that story, those 3 paragraphs with a little bit of verb and a little bit of humor, or you can write them the same boring way you did the week before, but you're still writing the same stupid article. And so it's like, I mean, I think it's a great question, but I also think even though there can be art in some of these other things, and maybe some of it, I mean, I think a lot of sitcoms are art. I mean, I think Simpsons should be like required for all art majors. But that's still different than the kind of free grappling that we hope for, and I think we should expect out of our artists. where it's not laid out for them, like, we need this from you by then.
I think there's a danger to putting our way up here too. I mean, I was fishing down the Bitterroot, and this old couple pulled up and started picking up rocks, and I couldn't figure out what they were doing. And because they were looking and turning them over, and so I went up and I said, what are you doing? They said, well, we're picking up rocks because we paint little scenes on them and sell them. And I mean, now that's not, I don't think it was probably high art by any means. It probably was, some of it was probably pretty ugly. But it was, I mean, the artistic impulse was really there. And so, I mean, it's kind of hard for me to say, like, are they better or worse than somebody who's doing, or more important, or is their impulse, where does that stand in the hierarchy of kind of human needs and expression? I mean, they were doing this, kind of, there's a little, they probably were making a little bit of money, but they were really doing it because they just had this wellspring of creativity and were painting rocks. That was pretty cool.
Yeah.
All art is rewarded posthumously.
Well, I want to relay a story. I'm not quite sure how this all fits in, but it's a story about market forces. I worked for the Sundance Institute for the first 10 years of its existence. I was the managing director, and we were charged with trying to bring to the forefront the legitimacy of independent film. At the time that I started in 1979, independent film was a very bad word, and it was very political and charged and the whole bit, and there was no path in the industry for it. And the industry is the movie studio. That is the market force and the economic engine that drives that particular art product. So we went about trying to create a series of endeavors that would legitimize independent filmmakers, and we succeeded. We ended up developing a film festival that was called the United States Film and Video Festival before Sundance adopted it, but created a national showcase for independent filmmakers. We created an interest in the studio marketplace for independent films. Originally, in the first couple years, all of these independent distributors popped up, and life was good because they maintained their desire to support original and compelling visions. Then, because there was money flowing through this newly formed marketplace, the studios wanted to be part of it. So they said, well, let's adopt you. Come in, New Line, come into Sony, or I forget all the marriages that occurred, but each of the major film studios then created an independent arm. And they made a new logo, and they made a new company, and then they touted that they were still supporting the compelling and independent vision. Then, as the marketplace forces come to bear, the discussion gets deeper and deeper into the bottom line. And then the pressure gets put on these people who are working for the studio but still maintaining their independence, and they're being forced to meet the corporate bottom line. And so they're having to create packages and newer deals, and then it becomes the Miramax has to have the Gwyneth Paltrow and the 4 fancy stars in their film, or they can't meet the bottom line expectation of Disney. And then the middleman, which was the original compelling vision promoter, gets suspended, and the independents move right up into the studios, and here we are back into the mass market driven 18-year-old is telling us who the films are and what's going to be funded. And so we created our success and our demise all in 18 years. Wow. So I don't know. I mean, the story that I'm hearing tonight, and I'm a bureaucrat. I work for the state, for the Arts Council. I help give out these itty-bitty grants. They're painful on our end, too. But the story that I'm hearing is one of the artists asking permission to be schizophrenic, to be left alone to do their work and to research and develop their madness. And over here to also put food on their table and keep a roof over their head. Sometimes You can marry it nicely, like Katie has done, where your work to put food on the table actually inspires your madness in developing your art. Sometimes you can't. All of the systems that used to exist of patronage are gone. We don't have a way where the foundations decide that they should fund you as the artist regardless of what your end product is going to be, just because they believe in your potential. I'm sorry that's gone. The science world has developed that better than we have. They have huge R&D endeavors that are legitimized on many levels, and 99% of them fail, and there's never an expectation that a product or fame will come out of it. It's just the human potential that is so enthusiastic. So I'm sorry.
Well, it's not your fault.
Sorry to understand.
Don't you think it's time for some wine?
Yeah.